Yeah.
Okay.
Not very well.
No? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Lee Saltz, and I'm the Vice President of Advocacy for the National Council of Jewish Women in Los Angeles.
Yay.
And there are some familiar faces here, but there's some people I have never seen before, and you're also young, which is so wonderful. And so I would like to welcome you and tell you a little bit about us before we present this auspicious panel. We are a grassroots organization of volunteers and advocates who turn progressive ideas into action. And certainly what we're doing today is a very progressive idea and certainly a lot of action. All right, we are an organization that's over 100 years old, and we age very well. We are inspired by Jewish values. We strive for social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, and families, and that certainly fits in well with what we're going to be talking about today. And we also work for safeguarding the individual rights and freedoms of people. If you like what you see, if you like what you hear today, we would love to have you join us. You do not have to be Jewish. You do not have to be a woman. All you have to do is be a person who says to yourself, you know, I want to be in the forefront of social change. I really want to make a difference. And this is an organization that can help me do that. So there are membership cards on the table as you go out. There's lots of information on the table as you go out. Most of the people here are representing different organizations. They have put their papers on the table as you go out. So that will give you a lot of things to take home. On your seat, you will find a package of paper. Number one, with the biographies of all these wonderful people who were on the dais. I would be here forever trying to read the things that these people have done. So you can read that at your leisure. You also find 3x5 white cards. Those are for questions. If you have any questions, write them on the cards. We will have people collect them at the end of the meeting, at the end of the panel presentation, so that our panelists can answer your questions. You also have a yellow card there, which is an evaluation card. Please take a moment or two to fill it at the end of the event today. We really appreciate your reactions. We use them in terms of planning future events, so we'd appreciate it if you fill them out. You can put them on the table on the way out. There are so many things I have to tell you about today. I hope that we get to our event. We will. But I do want to give a special thanks to the co-sponsors of this event: 1 Billion Rising, Peace Over Violence, the Women's Advisory Board of the City of West Hollywood, Sojourn and the Male Violence Prevention Project, the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center, and the Hollywood and Miracle Mile Now. Now, you know that advocacy is only one part of the National Council of Jewish Women. But we believe that it is one of our missions is to try and educate people in the community about what is going on. And so we are presenting an in-depth panel discussion on health care in California with a California Insurance Commissioner, Dave Jones, and it's being moderated by Dave Ryan of KCAL and CBS News, and one of the other speakers will be Dr. Sung from UCLA, who is very knowledgeable on the Affordable Care Act and also very prominent in the field of trying to make California one of the first single-payer states in the United States. That is March the 13th, and I really hope you plan on attending. One of the other things that we have going on here is a Women's Action Training Project. And this is a workshop that focuses on providing advocacy training for today's women and men, because one of the things that is critical is that you have to let your voices be heard. You have to tell people how you feel about issues. And so this is a training in public speaking, in media relations, in social media activism. And it is co-sponsored by Planned Parenthood Los Angeles, the League of Women Voters, and if you're interested in the lobby, there is information on the table about this workshop. What else do I have to tell you about? And then this spring, Women Helping Women will have a teen dating violence workshop for parents. And this is really important. We all grow up, and a lot of us, whether we're aware of it or not, our parents become our role models. They become our role models in how we watch interaction between what is going on in our house. And so this workshop, it's a 2-hour workshop, is going to help parents and caregivers of teens identify signs of teen dating violence, and will help educate parents in dating violence prevention and intervention, and give parents the opportunity to support each other in reducing teen violence in the community. We have now started a film series to try to get some of the best films to our community. The first one is going to be April 17th, and it's called Carbon Nation. It has to do with the climate and what is happening to our community by the carbon emissions that are going on. The film is an 84-minute film. It is an amazing film. And the speaker that will help guide us through the film is Andy Lipkus. For those of you who don't know Andy, Andy is head of the Tree People. If you want to drive up to Coldwater Canyon in Mulholland, you will see a huge, huge campus called the Tree People. And he is just an amazing person who travels all over the world in terms of helping people recognize what is going on with carbon emissions. We are then going to show another film called The Revisionaries. The Revisionary, I have seen the film. I find it very frightening. It takes place in Texas. It talks about 15 people who control the textbooks that are put into the schools in Texas. They control what the kids learn and what they don't learn. And it is a very, very, to me, frightening film. And the last film that we will be showing is called, excuse my French, La Rafle, and it is about the greatest mass arrest of Jews ever carried out on French soil. It is known as the Velodrome de Hiver. A book was written about it called Sarah's Key. A television movie was made called Sarah's Key. And it talks about this area next to the Eiffel Tower in Paris where 13,000 people were rounded up in Paris and in suburbs and were sent and deported to death camps. It is quite a chilling film. So we have a lot on our plate, and we hope you'll come and join us. The National Council of Jewish Women has always been in the forefront of violence against women. They have a program that's called Higher Ground, and it has to do with domestic violence. And so we come to today's panel with a background of working on helping to reduce domestic violence by improving the economic status of women and grounded in the understanding that economic security is certainly critical to women's safety. And now we transfer it even to teenage safety. I need to tell you, I taught for 17 years at Fairfax High School across the street. I taught teenagers, I taught health education, I taught human sexuality, and one of the things that I used to do is I used to do role playing. I would have the boys take the role of a girl, and the girls take the role of a guy, and work on how do you interact in a social and dating situation. So I feel that we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go, because somehow our society has gotten more violent, not less violent. So I'm going to introduce to you now the moderator of our panel. Let's see, Pagana, I think I've given you all the information I need to give you, because otherwise. And the moderator of our panel is Lindsay Horvath. And Lindsay is the regional coordinator for the V-Day's 1 Billion Rising campaign. And that's what we were dancing about today and clapping about when you came in. And Lindsay will introduce the rest of our panel members. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Lindsay.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yay.
Thank you very much. So just for my sake, I want to know a little bit about the room. So if you're under 20, raise your hand. Okay, so I'm getting to you. So under 20 is not in the room, and we're talking about teen dating violence. So the most important thing we can do today is take everything that we're learning and find a teenager to invest it in, because we got to plant those seeds. Okay, so now who has a teenager? Okay, this is good. So you have some teenagers to start with. This is great. We're planting some seeds today. And who wishes they were a teenager? Ruth? Or Brady? Okay. All right, so we all are invested in this subject for one way or another. Okay, and I got you talking. Good, we got some energy going. Okay, great. I am the regional coordinator for 1 Billion Rising. We stop traffic up on Santa Monica Boulevard, so if we stopped you, I'm sorry. Today we have 1 billion people on the planet rising in a commitment to ending violence against women and girls. UN statistics tell us that 1 in 3 women in her lifetime will be raped or beaten, and that's over 1 billion people on the planet. We know that 1 billion people on the planet being violated is an atrocity, but 1 billion people rising in a commitment to ending violence is a revolution. And so you are part of the revolution today. I'm so grateful that you're here. I want to start, I'm going to have each of our guests just jump right in, because there's so much. I am so honored to be on this panel. Their expertise is beyond comprehension, and I'm just so grateful to be here. I'm going to start with Barry. If you could help us, have say a few words about yourself, but also help us give a context to this conversation. What is, when we talk about teen dating violence, what is that? What are we talking about?
Okay, I'm going to stand because I'm short. We may be rising, but we're not growing. My background is many years of organizing to make social change to prevent violence against women and girls. I've done a lot of that through teaching and as a psychotherapist, and also through my books on teen dating violence. And I have some with me today. I'd like to set a context. Patty Giggins and I are working on a revision of a book we wrote for parents, and I'm glad that there are parents here today. And I'd like to give you a context by telling a quick story about Dana and Jason, who are 16 years old, go to the same high school, and have actually been going together for 8 months. Their experience is typical. When things are good, Dana and Jason get along really well. They're happy, they enjoy hanging out with each other, and their friends all call them the perfect couple. They look great together. They're happy together. However, Jason can also be very temperamental. He's edgy, he's critical, he blows up easily. He's constantly criticizing Dana. He punishes her for her mistakes. And what's a mistake? Anything that he feels is wrong. She can't always figure that out. He's also jealous and possessive. He accuses her of dressing too sexy, flirting. Sometimes he actually accuses her of having sex with other guys. He texts her constantly to find out where she is or to make sure she's not going anywhere. She's aware that she can't do anything separately from him, like hang out with her best friend, for example, and that he knows how to hurt her feelings, and he does it by teasing her and by diminishing her, demeaning her. Sometimes Dana thinks that Jason's demands prove his love for her. She knows she's important to him, but she's become more and more afraid of doing something or anything that will trigger his temper. To keep the peace, she tries to please him. When he wants to know where she's been, she attempts to tell him the truth. When he barrages her with questions, she tells him what she thinks he wants to hear. Sometimes she realizes it really doesn't matter what she says, right? Because he's going to twist it, and whatever she says, he's going to get angrier and angrier. In the beginning, sex was special between them, but lately he's been more rough, and she just gets very quiet and tries to get it over with. He's hit her a few times. Afterwards, he felt sorry and then was really afraid that she would leave him. Dana's usually a very happy person. She's full of energy, but when the tension between her and Jason gets bad, she gets withdrawn and depressed and tense. She gets such bad stomach aches, her doctors think she's developing an ulcer. She's broken up with him a couple of times. Yeah, after really bad incidents, she tells her mom they had bad fights. She calls them fights. Her mom notices the changes in her behavior. For example, Dana doesn't care about school so much as she used to. She doesn't care about her appearance so much. And she's jumpy, quick to answer the phone, and most of all, or text, and she's ready to drop anything if Jason insists. She apologizes all the times, and she even criticizes herself a lot. And she's not talking to her parents about what's really going on. So what are we talking about today when we talk about teen dating violence? I just want to we're talking about this kind of a pattern, which we often think of it as hitting or as physical abuse, but it's far more complicated than that. We're talking about a pattern in which someone, the abuser, repeatedly forces or coerces the other person to get their way. We saw a lot of that in what happened with Dana. Verbally attack, demean, or humiliate their partner to keep control over them. Use or threaten physical force, and make or force the other partner to participate in sexual acts. And the threat is emotional, much more often than it's physical, but it's often both. And we'll come back to, I can talk about some of the ways in which, we can talk today about some of the ways in which Jason actually maintains control, keeps Dana completely accessible to him by making her feel bad about herself, by making her dependent on him, by making her pay attention to him. She's watchful about him, afraid to make him feel bad, afraid to make him angry. And so we call that overall a pattern of coercive control, which is the key element to these kinds of abusive relationships. We're not talking about two teenagers who get in fights with one another. It's a big difference. In this relationship, one person is afraid of the other.
Thank you. So next we have Ava from NCJW, and we're so glad to be here, and thank you and your organization for hosting this amazing panel. Your expertise leads right into what Barry was talking about. You know, can you pick up on that and tell us, you know, help us understand, you know, for the layman, what is the science that gets into some of the issues that, you know I find myself saying, what's wrong with people? And then when I'm being a little more heartfelt and really trying to get to the heart of the issue, I want to understand really what is going on here. So can you help us get to some of those core issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I'm a therapist, I'm a clinical social worker, and, you know, I think that one of the things that we find really helpful is understanding what it is that makes people vulnerable to getting involved in these relationships. And I think there's often a misperception that, you know, people are only at risk for becoming involved in a dating violence relationship if they experienced abuse in the home. And that's not true. But if somebody experienced abuse in the home, that does increase their vulnerability for sure. And part of the way that I think is most explanatory, the way of thinking that I think explains this the most is something that we call attachment theory. And attachment theory basically describes how all of us as humans are hardwired to develop in the context of relationships. Our brains are really, have evolved in a way where a lot of our brain development actually happens after we're born. And it requires the presence of a caregiver and certain environmental experiences for us to develop fully in the way that maximizes our potential. And if you think about it, human beings are really quite vulnerable when we're born, and for the first, many years of life, we're really not able to fend for ourselves. We really require caregiving. And so it makes sense that the whole brain and the whole system is wired to stay in connection with the person who will take care of us, because we really need to do that for our survival. So if you think about that, you think about how essential relationships are, and how, how core it is to survival, that we stay in relationship, and our brains are wired to do that. So that is part of what helps us understand why, when somebody becomes attached, why that can feel like a life or death situation, because our brains are really wired to experience it that way. Interestingly, teens are particularly vulnerable to disrupted attachment relationships because of the way that their brains are developing during adolescence. So one of the things we know is that around puberty, the brain actually reaches its maximum volume. The brain has grown to have more cells than it will ever have again in its life. And then from puberty until late teens or early 20s, there's a process of pruning where the brain is actually weeding out the parts that are not being used and refining the connections between neurons that are being used. One of the theorists who I like a lot, Dan Siegel, says that neurons that fire together wire together. So basically it's sort of a use it or lose it situation. And it's during the teen years that those experiences are really shaping so much the way that we respond to our environment. One of the key things that relationships do is they help us manage our emotions. And those of you who have teenagers or remember being a teenager probably remember how volatile emotions can be in the teenage years, right? Part of the reason for that is that the part of the brain that really helps modulate emotion is the prefrontal cortex, and that part of the brain is developing at that time. And so, there's a misconception, and I really want to address this too. There's a misconception that teens make poor decisions, and you may have heard that teens, make poor decisions about who they date, or they make poor decisions about using drugs, or they're reckless. And I just want to dispel that idea. What research has shown is that teens are actually perfectly capable of making good decisions when they're in a calm frame of mind. But what we think teens are more vulnerable to is when their emotions get stirred up. And in fact, when any of our emotions get stirred up, we don't make our best decisions. I'm sure you've all experienced that. But teens have a harder time calming their emotions down because of the way their brain is still developing. And so that makes them particularly vulnerable to having their emotions aroused and then having a harder time calming that down. So that makes them especially vulnerable. And then if they've had insecure relationships in their families, that does increase their risk.
That explains why everyone still thinks I'm a teenager. I want to, a lot of times our conversations are so heteronormative in the way that they're structured, but I want to turn to Tara to talk about, as our teens are figuring out who they are and what relationships they're going to pursue, sometimes we're not always thinking about, we get locked into, oh, my girl's dating this boy and is he being nice to her, but maybe the girl next to her isn't being so nice to her either, and it's a different kind of relationship going on. So can you speak to maybe some of the key things we can look at as, in teen dating relationships, same sex?
Hi everyone, so my name's Tara Slavin. I'm the lead attorney and project manager of the Domestic Violence Legal Advocacy Project at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center. And we provide civil legal services and mental health services to same-sex and transgender and bisexual people in relationships who are being abused. And that includes teens and abuse. And one of the things that I imagine this is going to be a slightly different audience, but outside of Ellen and Portia, can someone tell me a positive same-sex relationship?
No partner.
Who is his partner?
Yeah.
So I think that I imagine someone can come up with one, but I actually think that sort of gets to one of the main challenges, right? Is we do not have positive same-sex role models for relationships, and when we increasingly know famous same-sex individuals, but it's very much not about the relationship. Because when we talk, a lot of times when we're talking about sexuality, it's already a taboo subject for teens, and then you add on, what that looks like if it's same-sex attraction, or someone is transitioning and identifying as the opposite gender that they were assigned at birth, right? How many different barriers that adds. You also, I think, have to take into account the fear of outing, right? The reality is that LGBT individuals are still, and youth specifically, are still disproportionately homeless, right? Versus the rest of the population. About 40% of homeless youth in LA County is LGBT identified, right? So when an abusive partner talks about, outing them to their family, it may mean that they don't have a place to go home at night, right? Or the near universal experience of hate violence in school for LGBTQ youth, right? And what that means when they say, oh, I'm gonna tell everyone in class, right? Or I'm gonna, let the teacher know, who may be espousing views that are very, fundamentally targeting same-sex and LGBT individuals in same-sex relationships. I feel like I could talk about this forever, so just a couple, and I know we're just trying to do an initial kind of overview. I do want to say is, one just sort of overarching thing is we say that domestic violence in same-sex relationships and LGBT relationships is happening and occurring at the same rate or higher, right? And for the first time, we got national statistics from the Youth Behavioral Risk Survey that are looking at teen dating violence that ask the question of sexual orientation, not gender identity. And their reports are actually coming out that same-sex people in the past 12 months are experiencing abuse in an intimate relationships 2 to 3 times as high, right? So that will be sort of the framing, and I look forward to speaking more.
Very good. Well, Patty, I know your work is, your bio I could spend days talking about. I just love the work that you do. Could you tell us a little bit specifically about the policies that you've been working on with Peace Over Violence to address teen dating violence issues and policy development?
Yeah, right. It's always great to come back to NCJW. I always like to be reminded that when I first started to work with my organization, our office was here back in the 80s. And so it's always nice to go. I had a little office upstairs and I painted it purple. Clearly once we all became more cognizant about the level of relationship violence, domestic violence, family violence, then we started to see that it actually started younger, that teenagers were beginning to practice. When they're dating, they don't call it dating now, but when they start to go out, hang out, they're beginning to practice what those relationships are going to look like when they do decide to get married and have a family. And so little by little, we started to realize how much those relationships really mimic adult relationships that have violence in it. And then we start to think about, well, if we're really going to prevent domestic violence, we have to start with young people. So preventing violence, working with young people in terms of the prevention of not only their own violence, preventing it from happening within their younger relationships, but also when we think of the future. So if we're really going to stop domestic violence, definitely have to work with young people. So we do now recognize that about 25 to 30% of teen relationships has the cycle of violence and coercive control in their relationship. So what do? How do we begin to have an impact on that in terms of prevention? Well, one of the ways is to be in school where kids are mostly and get to the kids directly. And you have to do that, you have to get through the system. You have to get through the principal, you have to get through the counselors, you have to get through the teachers to get to the kids, right? So that means we're really working within an institution. And all the policies and protocols and resistances that schools have to bringing in things that are not the basic teaching curriculum that they're responsible for. So we've been working on that along with many other allied organizations on really getting to the kids and doing teacher trainings and try to I think one of the most important things that we've been working on is to make it visible. You know, the worst part about violence and what makes it so insidious is that it is invisible. You know, it happens when nobody's around. And so we've been doing that for several years now. So we're getting to the place of trying to, within our school districts, here in particular in California, certainly in LA, we're trying to work on policies and protocols and procedures so that if teachers perceive some type of relationship violence, coercive control going on in their classroom, in their hallways, that they're gonna do something about it. And for example, one of the worst things that can happen is if you are in a relationship and someone's abusing you, and someone else sees it, and they say nothing, that they accept it completely as normal. And this happens all the time. So you'll have in school, you'll in the hallway, you have somebody who takes their partner, the girlfriend or boyfriend, slams them up against a locker. And, you know, students are walking by, teachers are walking by, they kind of glance, they see, oh, what's that about? Okay, I'm gonna go the other way. And so this actually then gives a strong message that, oh, that's kind of normal to the person, to the victim, that, okay, nobody cares about this. I guess this is what my relationship is supposed to be about. Right? So that's one of the real barriers that we're trying to break down, and that's recognition. And then to train people to intervene in appropriate ways. And we've been working particularly with LAUSD on a very exciting policy. I'd like to say that it took us, were able to get this policy through quickly. It took us 10 years. We worked, and that's the thing about policy, and we all have to do that. Those of us that do this kind of work, I think we've all come to realize that, you know, things don't change on the dime. You cannot get institutions to change swiftly. So we worked for 10 years, and we developed a teen dating violence and healthy relationship policy. Because that's the other side of it, is kids not being able to know really what a healthy relationship is. How many of you, when you were growing up and you were dating and you thought about, oh, I really want to be in a healthy relationship? Raise your hand. Right. So this is a kind of a new concept for adults and for children to think about what constitutes a healthy relationship. So we have a policy that we were able to get passed at LAUSD. Quickly tell you a story about this policy. There's a lot of poignancy to it. As I said, we worked on the policy for 10 years. We had a date. We had all the votes for the 5 votes on the school board members. They're going to vote for it. Very excited. Press conference planned outside of Beaudry, and on a Tuesday. We couldn't be more excited. On Friday, there was a tragedy on Southeast High School. A young girl, 17 years old, Cindy Santana, was killed by her boyfriend. She was stabbed in the cafeteria during lunch. Unfortunately, Cindy died. This was Friday. We were supposed to have this policy in place, begin to put the policy in place, get it passed on Tuesday. And this has happened before around the country. But what made us at Peace Over Violence so happy about what was going to happen, we thought, oh, we're not going to lose another girl. We're going to get this policy in. We're not going to lose another girl, nor are we going to lose another boy to a lifetime in prison. We're going to do this. Unfortunately, this happened. And the backstory was that she had broken up with him. He had been abusive to her. They had been going out for many years, and little by little, their relationship deteriorated. She told her mother about it. He got really upset at the mother. He made threats to the family. Because of that, he got arrested and was put in jail. The mom, Cindy told her parents, her mom, about what was going on. So she had an ally in her mom. They went to the school and told the school. And when he got out of jail, he went to the school, went to the campus. And the mom had told the school principal that he was getting out of jail. But he went to school, and this happened. So we then proceeded to get the policy very poignantly passed at LAUSD. And what we're working at now is the implementation. And we've set up a pilot project in a couple of 2 middle schools and a high school. And we're trying to work out the details, because what we want to do is on every campus at LAUSD, and we hope this will be a model for other school districts, every campus at LAUSD would have a person, whether it's a counselor or an assistant principal, who would, in their portfolio of duties, be trained in how to respond, how to make sure that, to recognize what teen dating violence looks like, and to respond if it is reported or if they see it, if the campus sees it. And teachers and students would also be trained in this. And so we're in the process of working out a pilot project, and I have to say that our team at Peace Over Violence, our youth leaders, there's not and they're in schools all the time, there's not a day, there's not a week that goes by that they don't think about Cindy Santana.
I'm so in awe of Patty's work, and many times I think, gosh, she does so much. She must be in 2 places at once, or at least 3. And today, that's actually true. Peace Over Violence is doing something right now downtown at Pershing Square with 1 Billion Rising. So it's true, Patty is literally everywhere at the same time. Before we get to Miguel, I want to go back to Tara, because I know you're working on something we're all, I'm sure, reading about, the Violence Against Women Act. And speaking of the policy and, you know, working through structures and it taking more time than any of us would like, can you kind of give us some insight as to what's going on and the work that you've been doing with it and sort of where we're at? And do we have any hope?
So I co-chair the national sort of LGBT Violence Against Women Act reauthorization effort, and I'm also a member of the steering committee for the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, which is sort of the main organizing body around the Violence Against Women Act. As people may have heard, the good news is that on Monday, the Senate passed, right, S-43 by a 78-22 margin, which is about 10 more than in 2012. Senators voted for it. An inclusive Violence Against Women Act that would include protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity, immigration protections, tribal protections, as well as many other basically necessary improvements to what is ultimately the sort of fundamental national law that addresses domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, and dating violence. Now we have to move to the House. And so what I will say is that we did not, last time, as people have probably heard, the 3 communities I just identified, tribal communities, immigrant communities, LGBT communities, and also communities of color, have really been targeted under the House version, as well as a general slashing of funds for all programs and sort of other negative provisions that are very much undermine the systems that have sort of been able to build up since 1994, since the original passing of the Violence Against Women Act. We need to put pressure, right, on our House of Representatives to pass a fully inclusive Violence Against Women Act. It is 2013. It is 2 years past the authorization deadline, right? It is critical that we are all speaking up, standing up, and saying, you know, we are going to pass this, and we are going to pass a good bill. So there's questions later about that. I'm happy to elaborate more.
Sure. Miguel, you have a very interesting project that you're working on with Sojourn, and you know, a lot of times we come to these conversations and we're like, yay for the men in the room, and there's always sort of this awkwardness about, you know, how do we authentically incorporate male voices into this conversation? Because a lot of times, you know, we know that the root cause of the violence comes from males that's perpetrated on women, and so the project that you're working on is really interesting and sort of really addressing that. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. But before I start, I just want to say how honored I am to be sitting here with such smart and intelligent people. It really is sort of stunning to be here, but I'm happy to be here. And I work for Sojourn, Services for Battered Women and Children, and I coordinate a couple of prevention projects. The one that takes up most of my time is the Male Violence Prevention Project, which Barry is a trailblazer on, and I'm learning so much every day about this issue. It's a citywide initiative, and different organizations in the city all acknowledge that masculinity. All the organizations in the city acknowledge that masculinity is at the root of violence, and we're working with adults in the city to sort of change the culture about masculinity, hopefully to reduce, if not eliminate, violence. And we're also working to promote a bystander culture. We like to call it upstander now, at least I do. Promoting that people say something when they see somebody being mistreated or whatnot. And it's monumental. There's a lot of resistance when working with schools or whatnot, but it's really more so, how do I say? Well, let me use an example. Will all the men in the room please raise their hand? So, as much as it is our issue as men and women, or however you identify, men need to step up to the forefront and really get involved in the conversation, because we can't do it without the men. So I'm happy to answer any questions about more specific things that we do, but the City of Santa Monica is working to implement this project, and I'm responsible for the day-to-day implementation and development. Oh, somebody said maybe West Hollywood. So hopefully. So thank you for having me.
You all have cards. If you have questions, please use those cards to write your questions out, and they can be brought up to me. Someone will collect them and bring them up to me so we can ask them. But do you want to talk about what do you mean by the bystander, upstander model? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, for example, if you hear somebody say something sexist as opposed to not saying something in return, say something, because very often people interpret silence as consent. So we're trying to flip that culture. For example, working with coaches, they use sexist remarks to motivate their players, and assistant coaches don't say anything, so the kids think it's okay. So we're really trying to shift that dynamic, so maybe even if not other coaches, kids will say something. But we're really working to get people to speak up when they hear or see something that could lead to violence or is just outright wrong.
And are you finding that that it's working? That the groups that you're working with are receptive to what you're finding and sort of shifting those models?
Our surveys say that people take away a lot of knowledge and it stays with them for a while. As far as the day-to-day, we might have to plant some molds to figure that out. But as far as knowledge is concerned, yes, it's working.
Barry, I know that you're working on a book with Patty, so I guess to either one of you, we do have some parents in the audience, so what are some tips that you would offer to parents, some tools that they could take home with them to sort of look for the warning signs? If they think something's going on, how do they get involved in a way that's going to be helpful and not make the problem worse, or make their children reluctant to engage with them about the subject?
Well, if you think about Dana and Jason, if this were your daughter, or if this were your son, what would you be noticing about the kinds of things that are happening? One of the things you would notice as a parent is that her behavior is changing. She's becoming more self-conscious, more critical of herself. Her confidence, her happiness is undermined. She's doing poorly in school for the first time. She's dropping her activities. This relationship is very isolating. So what you're going to see, and one of the main warning signs, is, first of all, that she's afraid to do something that'll get her boyfriend upset. That fear is not normal, it's not healthy. We don't find that in most relationships. If you see it in a relationship, if you see your daughter reacting that way, if you see your daughter or son actually having that kind of an impact in a relationship on their partner, then you want to make sure that you talk openly and directly with them about what's going on in the relationship. The isolation, the giving up things, restrictions, I can't go anywhere or do anything, don't see my friends anymore, the kinds of things, those kinds of changes that you see, those are big, big clues. Now, Ava will tell you, that's also teen romance, right? You see it in the movies, probably none of you here go to teen movies, but if you do, you'll see a lot of this. You'll see that another aspect of adolescence is that this is very romantic. Dana actually thought that he loves me so much that he doesn't want me to hang out with my friends. He wants me all to himself. And what starts out as being very romantic turns into a prison. And when you feel like you're in a prison, it's not a healthy relationship. It's an abusive relationship. It crosses the line from being unhealthy to being frightening, intimidating, controlling, and you feel locked in and you can't make a move. It's very hard to get out of a relationship like this. And we also talk about the emotional safety as well as the physical safety as being important in these relationships, and being able to identify, Of course, one of the major warning signs is the bruises. If somebody's being hit, we see the injuries and the excuses for those injuries. But we have to look way beyond the injuries, the physical injuries, because it always starts with verbal and emotional abuse before it ever escalates to physical. So those are just a few tips.
And I think in terms of once you do either recognize it or your child may have admitted it and is beginning to disclose, it's a very delicate time when for that intervention to happen and how we as parents react to this information. I know the first book that Barry and I wrote, we asked parents, what would be a good title? We were interviewing a lot of parents, what would be a good title for this book for parents on preventing dating violence? And pretty much every parent had the same version, which is, I want to kill the bastard. And when we asked the student, the young people,
not to do that.
Right? When we asked the young people who have been in these relationships about, well, were your parents helpful, or what would you title the book? And they said, title the book, Parents You Don't Have a Clue. So that kind of does speak to this divide that can be existing between parents and children, especially in adolescence. And one of the things that we've discovered that's so important is when you intervene, coming in and saying, okay, you can't go out with him anymore, you can't do this, you can't do that, I'm going to go with you here, tell him not to come over here anymore, and you get in and you become the controlling parent. So then the person, the victim in this, now has the controlling boyfriend or girlfriend, and now they have a controlling parent, and they're caught
And you know what
in this
Patty and
bus.
I always say? Don't ask your teen to pick between you and her boyfriend.
Right. Exactly.
Boyfriend will win.
Yeah.
I just want to add a quick sentiment. I had asked my partner if I could share this story at some point, but she was in an unhealthy relationship with one of her first boyfriends, and the funny thing is, she said to me, she goes, the second her mother told her she didn't have to be in a relationship, she dumped the person the next day. She actually thought, because she was fulfilling her expectation that she would be in a dating relationship in high school with a guy, right? And it was just that simple, you don't have to be in it, right? That allowed her to exit the relationship.
The other thing that I wanted to add to what Patty said, and then we can maybe move on from this particular issue because we feel so strongly about this, is that what we have found over the years that is the best thing that parents have to offer their kids is a strong relationship. Yeah. We all know that adolescents find their friends to be very important to them, but we don't want to give up our relationship so that they have only their relationship with their friends. The kids that I've worked with, the kids that we've known, the prevention programs we've worked with, when teens have a strong relationship, a strong connection with their parents, no matter how you feel about the choices they're making, the bad decisions, as Ava talked about them, when they're emotionally, charged up, if they keep that strong, steady, I'll support you, I'll be there, I'm there to protect and talk to you about your safety, help you learn to make good decisions. They aren't born knowing how to make good decisions. I'm going to help you learn how to make good decisions. That has kept so many girls that I have worked with safe. We are a safety net as parents.
Can I just chime in a little bit, just to add a little attachment piece to all of that? So one way you can tell the difference between the pull of a relationship that's a healthy relationship, because it is developmentally appropriate, as Barry was saying, for teenagers to be more drawn toward their peer group and less toward their parents. And that makes sense because they're developing toward, separating. But you can tell the difference between a secure relationship or an insecure relationship because, a secure relationship will make somebody actually more open to exploration. So if you think about like a toddler, who's playing in the playground, who checks back in with the parent and then goes off and plays, and then if something scary happens, comes back and checks with the parent, that's using the parent as that secure base, that attachment figure. We actually do that all our lives. And so a relationship that's healthy should still encourage your teen to be exploring the world, to be exploring her own interests, to be growing. And a relationship that's shutting that down is not a healthy relationship. So that's one way you can tell. And as Barry was saying, if the parent also continues to function as that secure base, just because our teens are drawn toward their peers doesn't mean they don't still need their parents. And so having that secure base in us will help them, settle back down and find their center again.
So one question we got is bullying a form of violence? And I hear a one-word answer coming, but I.
Bullying, you know, I view bullying as a tactic of power and control, and absolutely a form of violence. And you have bullying in a lot of different situations. You have bullying within a relationship. You have bullying within a marriage. You have bullying from within the workplace. You can have bullying tactics where you're getting pushed around by your boss. You have bullying within institutions. You have bullying on sports teams, when sometimes it's the coach who bullies the teammates. So it's really interesting about, we have this view of elementary school and the younger kids, the second, third, fourth, fifth graders, jockeying for position and either being bullied or being a bully. But it's actually, I believe, a tactic that people can use across the lifespan, which is, it's a way to act out power and control.
I just want to add, because I think you were making a comment earlier about the boyfriend pushing the girlfriend up against the locker, and the first thing that came into my mind at that point is like, that's the stereotypical example given of the straight student pushing the gay queer student up against the locker room, right? Up against the locker, and that level of power and how that affects, and really the bystander and upstander sort of piece, right? Like the way in which that is so normalized that people aren't intervening.
Yeah, so just want to say this, I'm really concerned that we're focusing on bullying only in this one aspect, which is with kids, when actually adults do a lot of bullying. And unfortunately, we as parents, sometimes we bully our kids, So we really have to start to look at that, deconstruct that a little bit about what it is about this behavior that we do, maybe too often in many scenarios.
So Ava, we got a question. Will you go to schools or talk to parents directly about understanding the needs of their teenagers? And I know the answer, but can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, well, actually, that's why we're having a workshop here, and Barry and Patty are collaborating with us to offer a workshop here at Women Helping Women for parents. We don't have school-based prevention programs. Peace Over Violence and Sojourn both do have those programs. We do the work mostly here in our clinic, and we have people who come here for therapy, although we do actually have programs where we go out into local shelters and community centers as well.
So you will work directly with parents?
Oh, absolutely,
Great.
absolutely.
And we received the question, why not start education in elementary school? Because the express sentiment in this question was, by middle school, kids are sort of developing their attitudes and perspectives already. How can we start having that conversation in an effective and age-appropriate way at the elementary school? Are you doing that, and if so, how?
Well, it's only recently that we've started to go into the middle schools. So I think your question is appropriate, like if we're looking at starting as early as possible, developmentally appropriate, and trying to teach and model for children in younger years, absolutely appropriate and healthy and non-bullying. And part of it has to do, I think, with the idea that we have to make kids be a certain way, and that kind of conformity. And so finding that balance as adults, where we do have a certain responsibility for children, a lot of responsibility for the younger they are. We have authority, and how do we manage the combination of taking responsibility, being the authority, and modeling healthy interactions with children?
I'd like to add to that, if it's all right with you, Leslie, and that is that there have been curricula around for elementary school, right from preschool on up through high school, to create violence-free relationships, skills that kids develop at every age along the way, from the time they're very little. And we've been, people like Patty and Ava and I have been teaching those kinds of skills since we started in this business. I don't want to tell you how many years ago, but that information is available. And if anybody wants to get on the bandwagon of starting, we're not just starting something. This has been around. And the fact that we're nobody thinks really, nobody in the field really thinks that you start in high school to teach kids about how to be in relationships. It starts from the time they're born, right? So the material's there, and we just need to keep advocating for it being included in the ongoing interactions with children wherever they are, at whatever age they are. Parents can do it with their kids as well as integrating it into every educational system there is.
But I still think that it's a problem that adults have.
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
It's like we
Every
want-
age, Patty, did you hear that?
I know, no, but yeah. But I think, no, serious, I really do think that, we read in the paper or we hear about this story and, a child's being hurt, or your own child's been hurt by another child. And, yet, as adults, we're not self-reflective enough about what kind of society we're creating, what kind of families, what are the dynamics in our own family that are perpetuating this.
So we talked a little bit about what are some of the signs you see in terms of the victim, but what are some of the signs you can you elaborate a little bit about the signs of a perpetrator that maybe your child is the one who's inflicting this abuse on somebody else? How do you identify that and address it?
Yeah. I think you got the picture. Certainly, if you were Jason's mom, what would you be seeing? Think about it. You'd be seeing temperamental, volatile, quickly blows up. If you say to him, if his mom did say to him, you've got a bad temper, you've got to watch it, and he'd blow up at her. She would hear him talking to Dana and being very critical, very cruel to her. He'd hear him, she'd watch him, he was very focused on her. He's very obsessed. That's the part often we miss, is that in the middle of all this controlling, he's paying a lot of attention to where she is and what she's doing, as well as her needing to pay attention to him, because that's where his focus is. So as a mom, don't you think you'd be seeing some of those signs? A lot of it could be hidden, a lot of it's happening when you're not around as the parent or the abuser of somebody who behaves this way, but when you see the signs, you need to assume that it's worse than what you see. And that what often happens with kids who behave this way is that the rationalization, the justification for it. So Jason would say to his mom, "You don't understand how she pushes me, Mom." And of course, if you were the mom, if you were Jason's mom, you'd want to believe, well, I can't understand why my son would behave that way. She must be really provocative. She must really push him too far. She must pressure him too much. Or whatever it is he says to explain. She's really going out with other guys and driving my son crazy. But you want, as a mom, to believe that. But if you see signs of this kind of a reaction, the kid needs help. Jason needs help. He needs an adult. He needs people around him. He needs his friends. He needs every adult, everybody he comes in contact with, to point out to him that the way he feels and the way he's treating Dana is not healthy and is heading for some really serious hurt, and that he can change. And one thing I love about working with adolescents is that they change. They can change. This is not a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old who's entrenched in the way he behaves and believes about his behavior. So.
And the brain is in the process
In the
of
process of
developing, so
developing.
it's such an opportunity.
So we've talked a little bit about the role that men can play a role in the conversation, an important one, especially in terms of prevention. But Miguel, can you talk a little bit about a bigger, getting even bigger picture? How do you address issues of masculinity and common stereotypes about masculinity, deconstructing that and what it means to be a man?
Wow. That's a really good question. Let me see here.
It came from them, so.
I want to go back a
Right
step,
here.
and I want to say that MVPP focuses on adults because we think that the responsibility of ending violence doesn't start with kids. We have to model the behavior and promote and support the behavior before it starts to change. But we also do have an MVPP-ish model that we work with fifth graders. Anyhow, to answer that question, we sort of stereotype or in the program talk about what is an ideal man, and you hear all kinds of things that can be problematic, and we revisit that exercise and we talk about, well, what do you mean by tough or strong, stoic or whatnot, and we sort of deconstruct it and try to rebuild it in a positive way, because everybody has their own definition of what it means to be a man. but you can find commonalities, and then we talk about those commonalities and how they can be problematic.
How do you work through that? Do you find that that the males in your group are responsive? They're willing to engage in a conversation about that?
You get a bunch of men in a room talking about men, they respond.
Especially if you keep the women in another room.
Right.
Can I jump in a little bit, just real quick, on the topic of masculinity? Because I think one thing that happens is that we code masculinity also with men. And I personally identify as a masculine female, and I think that coding in of itself, and I don't necessarily know the answers to this, but the way in which we code violence as masculine, right? But we also know that masculine identified people are often the ones automatically assumed to be perpetuating that violence. And that's not necessarily the case, and it's actually something that someone can use to say, no one's going to believe that you're being abused, right? Because you're the more masculine person. So I think it's important, I mean, these are very complicated, right, social gender issues, right? But it's important that we're dissecting that we're really exploring that sort of fuller spectrum of masculinity and how that plays itself out.
So to change gears a little bit, I realize I jumped ahead by assuming everyone in the room kind of knew the context of the Violence Against Women Act. So can you sort of, in general terms, talk about what the Violence Against Women Act says, what it intends to do?
So I laughed, I saw this card over here, it's like, what does it say? It's 200 pages.
It's just, what does it say in a nutshell?
I was like, the Violence Against Women Act was passed originally in 1994. Probably a lot of people have heard, right? It was Joseph Biden's current vice president. He was one of the original co-authors of the bill. It started out really focused on domestic violence and has expanded to the 4 crimes, which are domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence. It's a combination of formula grants, which are state-based funding to address those 4 crimes, be it through law enforcement, social service provision, courts, right, restraining order assistance, all of those different things. And then there's these discretionary grant funding streams. So there's about 19 discretionary grants. In all, I think it's been over $2 billion in funding for services around these 4 crimes. Since 1994. So it's sort of, it's dramatically decreased rates of intimate partner violence and has seen sort of massive awareness grow around these issues since that time. It's also, I can just say in the context of sexual orientation and gender identity, which is what I am most, that's like my, we're really talking about 14 words. That's it, 14 words being added into the 200 pages, right? So when there is all this sort of hostility and anger, that's what's being discussed. And it's really 3 provisions. One is non-discrimination in services, and I believe and really hope everyone does believe that a survivor should get services. And that's not always the case based on sexual orientation and gender identity. It's also addresses the STOP funding, which is the only gender-specific provision that allows for that is meant is in certain states, LGBT service providers have not been eligible for funding because they weren't primarily serving women if 50% of their population was hypothetically gay men. And the third provision is addressing sexual orientation and gender identity as an underserved population, which, given the invisibility of the issue, I have no problem saying it's an underserved community.
How are we doing on time? Bad moderator, I didn't bring a watch.
10 after 1.
10 after 1, so we have another 10?
Do we have some more questions?
Yes, we do.
Let's go.
All right, I like this. Okay, so we have a general question for anyone on the panel. From your experience working with victims of violence, what sort of activities have you found successful when you're facilitating a group for support for victims or educating about violence? What are some of the ways you can engage young people effectively to talk about these issues in a productive way?
Well, that is something I do, so maybe I should answer that question.
Come on, Barry.
That is a long answer. If you have a few hours of time, we can have a chat. But I'll say that there are a couple of things that I've already addressed as for parents that are true of the clinician too. if you're in a relationship, whether it's a professional or family or a friend relationship with someone who's immersed in a relationship that's demanding all of her emotional and cognitive attention, then you want to have some of the therapy, some of the way you're going to help her is to get her attention onto something else. So one of the main strategies I use in working with someone, first thing I do is have a conversation about safety. Are you emotionally safe? Are you physically safe? What are some things you can do to keep yourself safe? The decision about breaking up or staying in the relationship is a very complicated one, as you can imagine. It's not easy to leave any relationship. And sometimes deciding to leave this relationship takes some time because it's hard to get away, even once you decide to leave. So we work on that when the person's ready to do that, when the victim's ready to do that. And at the same time that you're talking about getting the focus away from this abusive relationship, you're focusing on building something, some strengths, some supports, activities, a life outside the relationship. And I find that the way in which that goes depends on both of those things happening. If you think that your whole life is wrapped up in this relationship and you have nothing if you haven't got this relationship, you're not going anywhere. So you build the strengths in terms of activities and friends and supports. Like with Dana, I would completely try to refocus on how she can get reconnected with school and with some of her friendships and push against the relationship a little bit for that to happen. At the same time that we talk about her being safe, not being in the car with him when he's been drinking, not, have a plan for how you're going to get away when he goes into a jealous rage. And so this is part of what Ava's talking about, teaching skills. How can you think about your own safety? How can you think about your own well-being? Your partner's not thinking about your well-being. How can you think about it no matter what's going on around you? So those are some of the key things that I would say I address. And I help parents provide that support system.
Can I add? Yeah. I would also add that, coming from more of an affect focus, a more emotion-focused approach, I think one of the things that we recognize is that people who are in an abusive relationship, a controlling relationship, are often in a state of fear. And that it may not look like the fear that you expect, because often when people are exposed to chronic threats, they may shut down. They may be hyper-aroused, they may be agitated, they may be visibly fearful, and they need calming and soothing from us. And they also sometimes may really shut down and withdraw and go inward, and they need to be pulled out. And so I think, a lot of what we do is, as clinicians, as therapists, or as anybody who's trying to reach out to somebody who's in this situation, is try to provide that secure base ourselves. And it goes along with what Barry is saying about having other supports, other strengths, but a lot of that needs to be relational, because if the person is getting all of their relationship needs met in this abusive relationship, they need to have another relationship where they can find safety and start to get some of those needs met. And one other thing that's really great is doing peer groups, because one of the big things is shame, and I think there's nothing like having a group of young girls together who had similar experiences. It's incredibly empowering.
So we have a question for all of our panelists, speaking to the idea of fear in reporting, especially the fear of parents, the fear that teens might have, but reporting these teen dating violence incidents. Can you talk about that, like sort of what goes into what some of those fears might be and how that plays out and addressing those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think fear of reporting is a huge issue, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, if the person's not out, reporting will most likely out them, right? If you're in a same-sex relationship. It may also be that they have experienced discrimination and harassment by service providers, or know that there's a bias and hostility, so that's just going to make it that much more difficult. And I think a lot of people can add a whole bunch more to this. I do also want to say we've been using a lot of terms, relationships, right, and dating violence, and I think one thing is that youth also don't necessarily identify those terms, and I just wanted to bring that up because I think they may not, what we may think of as a traditional, like, oh, that's a dating relationship, if they're not responding to that language, it may be difficult to sort of reach and communicate with the youth themselves.
Yeah, and I guess when people say reporting, they're thinking reporting to authorities, reporting to the police. And usually what happens with that, if there is an acute when the report happens, it's usually when there is an acute situation going on. What happens is often, most of the time, those acute situations are hidden. So it happened in the past, and it's much harder to report about something that happened 3 weeks ago, a month ago, 2 months ago. Because then there's not much that the police can do. We've been working with the police to try to get them to be also more sensitive about, just like in terms of police recognizing same gender relationships, but also other aspects of adolescent relationships. But unless there is some kind of extreme case, it's not really going to get reported to the police. What can happen, though, and it's legal now for young people to get restraining orders. And just like adults, a restraining order is only as good as whether or not the person who is supposed to respect the restraining order stays away. You know, and so that is one aspect of a legal intervention. If the people aren't living together, if they're adolescents and they're each living in their own homes, you don't have this issue of cohabitation where somebody has to be, cops are called and somebody is arrested or removed from the premises. So there are these different kind of dynamics in terms of reporting. Often, as I said, a lot of the relationship is underground, and the people that are going to hear about it are either a good friend, maybe a trusted adult, or a parent if it's disclosed to the parent or discovered to the parent. And then the parent can sometimes be a leader and join with their child to get more of an environment that can help by explaining the law. If this ever happens again, these are what your rights are. So it's actually it's complicated when it's not in an acute, situation. You just don't call the cops. It's not going to happen.
I have a couple ideas. If you live in a community or in a family that doesn't have much trust or respect for the police department, they probably wouldn't report. Also, if you're not supposed to be dating, you probably won't report to your parents, let alone the police.
So, one aspect, a question that was brought up, does violence in video games, I guess because teen culture is often related to video game playing, access to internet, social media, living in a digital age, how do these things play more or less of a role? Are we hyping up the role that they play in violence in teen relationships, or the way teens relate to one another, not relationships because they don't like that word? Does social media, technology, video games, does all of that sort of play a role in cultivating a violent culture? And if so, how?
Of course, it plays a role. Whether a conflicting evidence points to it or not, we kind of all know instinctively that watching too much violence, actually, some of the studies show that actually being glued to a screen, whether it's the cell phone, the iPad, the monitor, for so many hours a day, we're talking about the developing brain in adolescents, I was reading recently where this one psychologist was predicting that our brains, the brains of the next generation and the next generation are actually going to look different. And research is underway and looking at it. Good thing that the brain has a lot of neuroplasticity, so that it can change. It can change for good. It can change for bad. But this is one of the issues of our time: violent media, pornography. When people think of violent media, but they don't always think about pornography. And I read recently that the two industries that were not hurt during the recession monetarily was pornography and gun sales. Very, very interesting. But it is an issue, and more parents have less and less authority on how much screen time their children have, because it is so accepted. And also parents spend a lot more screen time watching. But there definitely is some correlation in studies that show a connection, a correlation between violent movies and committing violence, but they have yet to prove the causation. So there's this debate, you know, in terms of evidence-based proof of it. But I think we all err on the wiser to continue to entertain the idea that this is an issue. This is an issue for our society. The kind of media, music, videos, language that's in the media, and the amount of time spent on the media.
I would just want to say, though, as much as true as all that is, that I think we, you know, especially when we're talking about 1 billion rising internationally, and we think about countries where they don't play video games and they're not on their iPhones all the time, you know, there's still a tremendous amount of violence. And so I just, you know, I think it really, you know, I mean, there are a lot of ways of perpetuating a violent culture and a violent mindset, not only contemporary. You know,
we need to keep that in context and also not throw out the baby with the bathwater, because I think we're also seeing a much better informed public when teens can get online, and if they don't want to talk to somebody they know about what's going on in their relationship, there's lots of information they have access to. Lots of questionnaires and websites for teens that alert them to the dangers of an abusive relationship, and where chats where they can get some help and get some information. And access to getting help is so much easier for parents too. There's a lot of information for us out there. There's only one other thing I want to add to this conversation about technologies, not so much violent media, and that's the role that technology plays in the abuse itself.
Yes.
And that's another thing that we all want to pay attention to. And that is how often we see now that kids are being abused via Facebook, via texting, via sexting. And our adolescents don't always get it about the future consequences of putting something online. You know, your boyfriend thinks you're gorgeous and wants to see you naked. So you shoot him a quick picture on your cell phone, and the next thing you know, it's viral. You know, and it's embarrassing, it's shameful, it can be used in a lot of different ways. It can show up for years to come. So the ways in which and Facebook, kids can be tracked through Facebook, through the GPS on their phones. You know, in a loving moment, you say, oh, sure, you can find me wherever I am. And then the next thing you know, you're being stalked. So we do, as adults, want to pay attention, a lot of attention, and really educate our kids about the long-term consequences of media involvement, whether it's video games or whether it's texting.
Well, we did receive, who gave me the card about the anti-bullying campaign Share? Raise your hand. There you are. Okay, you're back in the corner.
I am Officer Cissy Torres with Los Angeles Police Department, and I was listening to your anti-bullying. I'm sorry, can I just... And I'm here with Detective Quijano, our department expert on domestic violence. And but I was introduced to the program Share, and this is an anti-bullying program that actually LAPD, in conjunction with the Sheriff's Department, have in play. And this is for the ages of 8 or 9. So in elementary, they'll be from 3rd or 4th grade, and it goes all the way to the high schools. And what Share stands for is Stop Hate, and Talk.
Respect everyone.
Yes. Stop.
I'm reading your notes. I got you.
I just got certified yesterday, so when you bringing that up, I was like, wow, I need to share this with you. And it's upon a request. If you have your elementary school have a request, LAPD or the Sheriff's Department come to you, we'll be more than happy to do it. And what we do there, we teach tolerance, diversity, and we explain what a hate crime is. And we go into the race, sexual orientation, gender, religion, and am I missing one? It should be all. But what defines a hate crime? And we oftentimes, from what the senior instructor shared, was that the kids still know they're doing something wrong. They don't know that it's wrong to hit someone. They don't know that it's wrong to say a racial slur. They don't know it's wrong. We had a little kid crying during class. He goes, I didn't know I hurt you. I'm sorry. I didn't know that was wrong. It's behavior learned with the friends. So it's a certified curriculum that our department psychologist approves, and it's very how would say it's age appropriate, and we of course ask the principal if it's okay okay, and we get permission from the parents and whatnot. But it's a really great program, and I could share more information on a later note if you emailed me, but I don't know if you could write it down. Or it's hate crimes at lapd.lacd.org. Email. But it's an awesome curriculum for the little ones. It's very surprising to see them, for them to know that they were doing something wrong when they thought it was fine, and they turn around, and it's a lovely program.
I see Lee coming to the podium, so I just have to take the last opportunity to tell you. Yes, of course, and then I'm going after you.
Going after me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I just wanted to acknowledge LAPD is in the house here, and I just want to say, if I might, on behalf of all of us, that we're so glad that you are now no longer under threat. That was a very terrifying week. Law enforcement, who are out there for us a lot, we're under threat and being stalked, and it's so glad it's over, and you guys are now safe.
As we wrap our panel, I just want to give one more shout out for 1 Billion Rising. The day is still going, so depending on what you're doing today, Culver City's rising at 2:14, so I don't know what you're doing in the next hour or so, but head over to Culver City. They're going to be dancing outside of City Hall. If you want, come to Santa Monica. If you're going to be there at 5 o'clock.
Ariel on Main Street in Ashland.
Oh, great. There's a handout that has a lot of other events, and there's also a big event going on at LA Live at 6 o'clock out in the open area, and we're really excited because we're partnering with Zumba, who's bringing thousands of their Zumba instructors in, so we're going to be breaking the chains and Zumbaing, so it's healthy for you all around. And it's also really exciting because the Lakers are playing the Clippers, so all of these unsuspecting sports fans are going to get a taste of what it means to end violence against women and girls. So please show up. Happy Valentine's Day, and thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to
Okay, so one last thing before you leave, because I know we all want to take some action. You have a paper on your seat which talks about things you can do. And one of the most important things is we talked about the Violence Against Women Act. You know that one of the reasons it's not being passed in the House is because the House is predominantly a group of people that start with an R. So we're hoping that maybe you will please write some letters that tell you exactly what to do to try to get the Violence Against Women Act passed in the House of Representatives. And then the other thing is, I made a mistake before, and I really want to rectify it. The screening of the Carbonation is April the 11th, so please put it on your calendar. I think it will be an amazing evening. And as President Obama said the other night, we really have got to start dealing with climate change. It's our job, not only the leaders, but it's our job also. Thank you so much for coming, and thank the panel. They've been wonderful.
I do have a few copies of the teams here. Looking at it.